When did the growth spurt actually start? Was it like after high school?
No, it was like when I was 20 years old.
That's crazy.
Like, I mean, literally jumped up like quick, man, stuff like that. Every time you put on a pair of pants, they come onto your knees almost. It's like you put on a pair of shoes, you got to cut the back off and make it like Dave and Buster's or some stuff like that. So it's like, but it's like, you couldn't, back like I said, we couldn't afford anything like that. So I had to go get a job and But yeah, that growth spurt was like quick.
Dennis Rodman spent his childhood feeling invisible. Basketball gave him a place to belong. But fame eventually turned that need to be seen into the persona the world couldn't look away from. That's the story, and it's a lot more complicated than the hair. For a decade, Rodman was the most impossible to ignore human being in professional basketball. Colored hair, full-body tattoos, piercings stacked on top of piercings. He showed up to a book signing in a wedding dress and arrived on horseback. He dated Madonna. He married Carmen Electra on a Vegas impulse at 2 in the morning.
Right. Wasn't that same year that you got married, then got divorced 82 days later?
Okay, that's one of, I'm sorry, we're going to call you a name, man. I was going to call you that F word. No, it's like, yeah, that's when I got divorced, married, all that stuff like that. Everything just started crumbling from that point on. I don't want to go in all that stuff like that because it all happened in once. And stuff like that. So,
He jumped into a wrestling ring on national television. He visited North Korea and came back acting like it was a perfectly normal thing to do. And somehow, between all of that, he won 5 NBA championships and became one of the greatest rebounders in the history of the sport. The legend is real. The championships are real. But here's the question nobody asks often enough.
They looking at me like, are you dead? I'm like, boom, like, oh, hell. And then that's okay, great. That I was so happy, man. The next thing you know, and I guess that's history started to be made.
Because before Dennis Rodman became the most outrageous figure in basketball, he was something completely different. He was a kid nobody noticed. Dennis Keith Rodman was born May 13th, 1961 in Trenton, New Jersey. But his story really begins in Dallas, Texas, specifically in the Oak Cliff neighborhood, one of the most impoverished parts of the city in the 1960s and 70s. High crime, dead-end streets, a place where just getting through the week was the goal. His mother, Shirley, was doing it completely alone, because Dennis's father, Philander Rodman Jr., had walked out when Dennis was 3 years old. Not a slow drift, not a complicated separation. He was just gone. He relocated to the Philippines, where he went on to father 29 children by 16 different women, providing nothing to the family he left behind in Dallas. Dennis would not see him again until he was already an NBA player. He wouldn't properly reconnect with him until 2012, more than 50 years after the door closed. Shirley worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table. She kept the lights on. She did everything she could. But that meant Dennis and his 2 sisters, Deborah and Kim, were often on their own in a neighborhood that wasn't forgiving to kids left unsupervised. And Dennis was not built for that world. Not yet. He was painfully shy. He would follow his mother through the apartment, clinging to the back of her shirt like a shadow. When she sent him to nursery school at 4 years old, he reportedly refused to move, just stood there, frozen, not willing to let go. His sisters were the athletes. Kim would go on to become a college All-American at 2 different universities. When young Dennis tagged along to their games, which he did constantly, people laughed at the awkward little brother trailing behind 2 real players. His own mother, according to Rodman, considered him the least talented of her children and made him feel it. At South Oak Cliff High School, he tried football. He was cut. He tried basketball. Standing 5'6" as a freshman, too small and too uncoordinated to hold a spot, he eventually quit the team because he couldn't get off the bench. By the time he graduated in 1979, Dennis Rodman had no plan, no scholarship, no skill anyone had bothered to document, no reason to believe anything was coming, just a diploma and a neighborhood that wasn't going to wait for him. The years after high school were about survival. He drifted through odd jobs. At some point, things got bad enough with his mother that she changed the locks and left his stuff on the steps. He describes sitting on the apartment stairs with a garbage bag full of clothes and nowhere to go. A friend let him sleep on a couch in a backyard. He washed cars when he could find work. Eventually, he landed a job as an overnight janitor at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. That was the situation. A kid who had spent his whole childhood feeling like he didn't matter, now cleaning empty terminals at 3 in the morning while the rest of the world slept. Then something happened that nobody saw coming. He grew, not slowly. Dennis Rodman, who had lived his entire adolescence at 5'6", grew nearly a foot in roughly 2 years. He went from 5'9" to 6'7". He later said he refused to leave the house during parts of it because he felt so strange in his own body. Around the same time, he was caught stealing watches from the airport gift shop on a dare. Not charged, but shaken. His mother kicked him out. He hit the lowest point of his life. And then someone in the family's social circle noticed what had happened to Dennis's frame and quietly tipped off a coach at Cook County Junior College in Dallas. The coach took one look and offered him a spot. Rodman was 20 years old. He had never played serious organized basketball in his life. He lasted 1 semester before his grades ended it. It could have been over right there. It nearly was. But Lon Reisman, an assistant coach from Southeastern Oklahoma State University, a small NAIA school in Durant, Oklahoma, that most Division I programs had never thought about, came to watch Rodman practice one afternoon. He was impressed enough to remember it. Not impressed enough at first to make an offer. He drove back to Oklahoma without saying a word, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. So he went back, and this time he made his pitch. Rodman transferred to Southeastern Oklahoma State in 1983. He was 22 years old. He had played organized basketball for approximately 1 year of his life. Over the next 3 seasons, he averaged 25.7 points and 15.7 rebounds per game. He became a 2-time NAIA All-American. At the Portsmouth Invitational Tournament, a pre-draft showcase in front of real NBA scouts, Rodman won MVP, outperforming Division I players who had been training for exactly this moment since middle school. A few years earlier, he was pushing a mop at 3 a.m. Now the Detroit Pistons were watching. They selected him 27th overall in the 1986 NBA draft. He was 25 years old, older than almost every other prospect in the room. He later wrote, "I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be an NBA player. I was just a kid from the projects who was always too skinny or too funny looking to be taken seriously." Detroit in 1986 was exactly the right place for Dennis Rodman. Not because it was glamorous, because it wasn't. The Pistons were not building a finesse team. Coach Chuck Daly had assembled a crew of hard men, Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, Bill Laimbeer, who took pride in making the game miserable for the other team. They called themselves the Bad Boys, and they meant it. What they needed was someone willing to do the work nobody else wanted. Guard the best perimeter player on the floor, chase every loose ball, fight for every rebound, take a hit and come back harder, accept zero glory for maximum sacrifice. That was Rodman's role. And it turned out the qualities that had made him difficult and strange his entire life, the reckless energy, the refusal to quit, the willingness to go places nobody else would, made him exactly what Detroit needed. But the basketball wasn't even the most important thing that happened to him there. The most important thing was Chuck Daly. Daly was demanding. He had precise standards and he enforced them. But with Rodman, he was also patient in a way that few coaches ever had been. He spent time with him. He invited him to family holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthday celebrations. He checked on him. He saw underneath the toughness to whatever was still raw and unfinished underneath. John Sally, one of Rodman's teammates, later said that the Dennis Rodman who arrived in Detroit was the kind of guy who ordered a glass of milk at the club. Quiet, almost childlike. The whole team described him as sweet, innocent, like a teenager who had somehow wandered onto an NBA roster. Daly gave him structure, he gave him accountability, and for the first time in Dennis Rodman's life, an older man was choosing to stick around. "When I went to Detroit," Rodman said later, "Isaiah, Joe Dumars, and Chuck Daly just embedded to me and said, 'This is a family. We want to win. We got to stick together.' That's how close we were." He had spent his childhood following his mother through the apartment because there was nothing else to hold on to. Now he had teammates, a brotherhood, and a coach who saw him clearly and stayed anyway. The Pistons won back-to-back championships in 1989 and 1990. Rodman was central to both. He won Defensive Player of the Year in 1990 and again in 1991. He became one of the most feared defenders in the league, a player who could guard any position, who studied opposing shooters so obsessively he seemed to know where the ball was going before they released it. Now we need to talk about how he actually played, because it was unlike anyone else. Most elite NBA players build their value around scoring. They need the ball. They need plays run for them. Rodman didn't need any of that. He had figured out something almost no one else in the league understood at his level, that a missed shot doesn't bounce randomly. It goes somewhere specific. The angle of the rim, the arc of the shot, the spin of the ball, where the other players are standing. All of it feeds into a single outcome, where the rebound lands. Rodman studied this the way other players studied film. He would stay after practice for hours, not shooting, not working on his handle, just watching the ball come off the glass, predicting trajectories, training his brain to arrive at the spot before anyone else. The result was 7 consecutive rebounding titles from 1992 to 1998. He averaged 13.1 boards per game over his career. He did it at 6'7", regularly out-rebounding centers who had 4 or 5 inches on him. He was named to the All-Defensive First Team 7 times. He could guard point guards. He could guard power forwards. His versatility was without precedent. His mother had actually given him the nickname the Worm years earlier, not for basketball, but for the way he wriggled when he played pinball. Now the whole league knew the name. Detroit gave Dennis Rodman the first place in his life where being different wasn't something to survive. It was an advantage. He had found somewhere he belonged. But nothing lasts. On May 5, 1992, Chuck Daly resigned as head coach of the Detroit Pistons. For the organization, it was a natural transition. The dynasty was aging, and coaching cycles end. For most of the players, it was painful but manageable. For Rodman, it was something else entirely. It was like they got rid of my dad, he said. Daly had seen this coming from a distance. As Rodman's behavior began to unravel in the months that followed, increasingly erratic, harder to manage, more disconnected, Daly said something that cuts right to the core of who Rodman actually was. That's Dennis's problem. He's lost himself. He can't see where one starts and the other ends. He's convinced he has to play up to that. I know that's not him. The shy kid I met is who he is. The shy kid. Without Daly, Rodman spiraled. His marriage collapsed. His relationship with the organization deteriorated. Then, in February 1993, a police officer found Dennis Rodman asleep in a truck in a parking lot with a loaded gun. He denied he was suicidal. But that image, the most feared defender in basketball, alone in a parking lot in the middle of the night, tells you how dark it had gotten. He was traded to San Antonio that same year. And what happened next in San Antonio is, in many ways, the most important chapter in the entire story. The San Antonio Spurs were built around David Robinson. Disciplined, professional, deeply principled, a Navy officer and team-first player in every definition of the phrase. On paper, adding Dennis Rodman to that environment made no sense. In practice, it was worse. The structure that Detroit had provided, the brotherhood, the father figure, the sense of purpose and belonging, was gone. And without it, Rodman began reaching for something else. The hair came first. He started dyeing it in San Antonio. One color, then another, then patterns. The tattoos multiplied. The piercings appeared. He started pushing against every expectation anyone had for what an NBA player was supposed to look like. Before San Antonio, Dennis Rodman was a strange basketball player. After San Antonio, Dennis Rodman was becoming a cultural character. Here's the distinction that matters. Playing in Detroit, even at his most intense, Rodman was still operating inside a recognizable identity. He was a basketball player, a great one, someone who belonged to a team, a coach, a system. In San Antonio, all of that came apart. And what replaced it was something he was building entirely on his own, an identity assembled from the outside in, designed specifically so that no one could miss it. Was it liberation? Was Rodman finally shedding a conservative NBA image that had always felt like a cage, finally becoming who he actually was? Or was it something more complicated? A man who had learned from childhood that being ignored was the worst thing that could happen, and who was now, without basketball structure to anchor him, doing the only thing he knew guaranteed attention? That question doesn't have a clean answer, but it's worth sitting with because it carries straight into Chicago. In the summer of 1995, Phil Jackson called Dennis Rodman. The Chicago Bulls were building towards something historic. Michael Jordan had come back from his first retirement. Scottie Pippen was still elite. The infrastructure was in place. But there was a specific problem the most famous franchise in basketball couldn't solve. They needed a rebounder, someone who could do the dirty work, defend multiple positions, and let Jordan and Pippen operate without worrying about what was happening on the glass. The answer was Rodman. This was not an obvious call. He was 34. He had come apart in Detroit after Daly left. He had been suspended repeatedly in San Antonio and was now as famous for his celebrity life as for his basketball. The idea of dropping him into the most disciplined, Jordan-controlled environment in the sport seemed, to many observers, like organized chaos. Consider the contrast for a second. Jordan, control, perfection, iron discipline. Pippen, reliability, versatility, team-first excellence. Rodman, chaos, obsession, total sacrifice for the rebound. Phil Jackson somehow made those three personalities function as one machine. He called Rodman, explained the situation, and asked if he could handle it. Rodman told him he didn't particularly care one way or the other. Jackson said, "We've got a deal." But before anything else happened, Rodman went to Scottie Pippen and asked for forgiveness. Because back in the Bad Boys era, Rodman had been one of the players who physically made Pippen's life miserable. He apologized. Pippen accepted. The experiment began. The 1995-96 Chicago Bulls went 72-10, the best regular season record in NBA history. No team has matched it. Rodman averaged 14.9 rebounds per game that year. He led the Bulls on the boards in 59 of 64 games he played. He grabbed 20 or more rebounds 11 times. In the finals against Seattle, he twice tied the league record for offensive rebounds in a single game. He averaged about 5 points per game. Nobody ran plays for him. That was never the point. Jordan said it plainly in Rodman's Hall of Fame tribute. "Dennis did everything we needed him to do. He was the missing piece." The Bulls won in 1996, then 1997, then 1998, 3 straight. 5 championships total for Rodman across his career. The man who couldn't get off a high school bench was now standing at half court as confetti fell, holding trophies most professional athletes will never touch in their lifetimes. But achieving everything you dreamed of doesn't automatically fix what was broken before the dream began. Somewhere during the Bulls dynasty, Dennis Rodman stopped being a person with an outrageous persona and became the persona itself. And that line, wherever it was, mattered enormously. By the mid-1990s, he wasn't just an NBA player, he was a phenomenon. He was dating Madonna. He was on magazine covers that had nothing to do with basketball. He showed up to his book signing in a full wedding dress on horseback. He appeared in movies, jumped into wrestling rings, gave interviews that left journalists unsure whether they'd been charmed or deceived, and everything sold. Every appearance generated coverage. Every controversy became a headline. This was not accidental. Rodman understood, intuitively and earlier than almost any athlete of his era, that attention was its own kind of currency. He had weaponized his outsider identity into a brand at a time when athletes didn't do that. Before social media, before athletes ran their own media operation, Rodman figured out that being impossible to ignore was a skill, and he was better at it than nearly anyone alive. Think about where that drive came from. A kid who was laughed at for trailing behind his sisters. A kid who couldn't make the high school football team. A kid who stood at 5'6" as a freshman and got cut and benched and overlooked until he was 20 years old. A kid who mopped airport floors at midnight. That kid was now impossible to look away from. But Chuck Daly's words kept echoing. "The shy kid I met is who he is." And the question that was harder to answer with each passing year was this: where did the shy kid go? Was the persona freedom, finally, completely himself? Or had the character grown so large that Rodman could no longer see around it? After 1998, the structure collapsed. The Bulls dynasty ended. Jordan retired for good. Pippen moved on. Phil Jackson stepped away. The machine that had made the last 3 years of Rodman's career possible was gone. He signed with the Los Angeles Lakers, 23 games, released. He signed with Dallas, his hometown, with Mark Cuban personally bringing him in, 12 games, released. The basketball chapter was closing, and without it, the question that had been building for years finally had nowhere to hide. Who was Dennis Rodman when there was no locker room to return to, no championship to chase, no coach to push him, no teammates to belong to, no opponent to obsess over? The answer, over the next decade, was difficult to watch. Alcohol became a documented problem. Legal troubles followed him. Public appearances became erratic, not outrageous in the way that made him interesting, but unmoored in a way that was something else entirely. He appeared on reality television. He made multiple trips to North Korea, presenting himself as a kind of unofficial ambassador to Kim Jong-un, generating enormous controversy and very few real answers. What he was doing in those years, it seems fair to say, was still searching for the same thing he had been searching for since he was a 3-year-old in Dallas without a father. A place where he belonged, a reason to be there, someone who wasn't going anywhere. Basketball had given him that. Fame had approximated it, but neither one had solved it. There is one part of Dennis Rodman's story that gets less attention than it deserves, and it is in many ways the most painful part of all. His father left when he was 3. Philander Rodman Jr. chose 29 other children over the one he already had, and that absence left what one account described as a crater, a hole in Dennis Rodman's life that never fully closed. Then Dennis Rodman became a father himself. 3 children, Alexis, born in 1988, DJ and Trinity, born in 2000 and 2001, and he was not consistently there for them. His relationships with their mothers broke apart. His lifestyle took him elsewhere. His children largely grew up without him present in the daily rhythms of their lives. In an ESPN interview, Rodman was asked about his kids. He started crying before he could finish a sentence. "I want to," he said, meaning he wanted to be better, to be present, to be the father he never had. But it isn't so easy. 4 words. And they're devastating precisely because they're honest. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't deflecting. He was naming a loop, the pattern his father had established, the wound it left, and his own failure to fully break the cycle, with a clarity that very few people would have been willing to voice publicly. His father was gone and never acknowledged the damage. Rodman looked into a camera, cried, and said out loud that he had let his children down. That's a different kind of courage than winning a championship, and it doesn't get nearly enough credit. At his Hall of Fame speech in 2011, Rodman thanked what he called his 4 horsemen: Chuck Daly, Phil Jackson, Lakers owner Jerry Buss, and James Rich, the father of a southeastern Oklahoma State teammate who had opened his home to Rodman during his college years, fed him, looked out for him, treated him like a son when nobody else was doing it. 4 men, 4 different moments in his life. 4 different pieces of what he had been missing since he was 3 years old. Daly gave him belief and a father's presence in Detroit. Jackson gave him structure and a second chance in Chicago. Buss gave him opportunity and dignity at the end of his career. Rich gave him something simpler and more fundamental: a table to sit at, a family to be part of, a man who acted like Rodman's presence mattered. Looking at that list, it's hard to miss the pattern. The man who spent his career being the most anti-establishment, irreverent, impossible to contain figure the NBA had ever seen was, underneath all of it, someone who responded to guidance. Someone who needed to be told, "You matter here. We are not going anywhere. You belong." Basketball placed those men in his life, one after another, and each time Rodman became something greater than he had been before. August 13, 2011, Springfield, Massachusetts. Rodman walked onto the Hall of Fame stage in a feathered boa and a jacket stitched with pistons on one arm and bulls on the other. His children were seated nearby. His entire history was in the room. He began to speak, and almost immediately he couldn't continue. He talked about his mother. He apologized to his children, directly, specifically, for not being present the way a father should be. He thanked his coaches. He said he hadn't played for money, hadn't played to be famous. "I played for the love of the game," he said, voice breaking. And then the thing that had defined him for 20 years, the armor, the character, the performance was gone. The boa was still there. The hair was still there. But Dennis Rodman, the entertainer, the provocateur, the man who had made himself impossible to ignore by turning his whole life into a spectacle, that person was not in the room. What was in the room was the shy kid from Oak Cliff, the one who used to order milk at the club, the one who had sat on apartment stairs with a garbage bag and nowhere to go, the one Chuck Daly had described decades earlier when he said, "That's not him. The shy kid I met is who he is." Standing at that podium, there was nowhere to hide behind the character. He just had to be Dennis Rodman. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. So what really happened to Dennis Rodman? A boy born into poverty and abandonment grew up with no reason to believe he was going to be anything. Nobody noticed him. Nobody expected anything from him. He went from a high school bench to an airport janitor shift, and that looked for a long time like the whole story. Then his body changed. Basketball found him. And for the first time in his life, the specific way he was built, the intensity, the obsession, the refusal to stop, was exactly what somebody needed. Detroit gave him belonging. Chuck Daly gave him something close to a father. The Bad Boys gave him a brotherhood. And for a few years, everything lined up in a way that it almost never does for people who start where Dennis Rodman started. Then Daly left. The foundation cracked, and Rodman built a new one out of the only material he had, his image, louder, bigger, more impossible to ignore with every passing year. He learned, somewhere between Detroit and San Antonio, that he could control how the world saw him, that he could make himself so large, so colorful, so relentlessly present, that nobody would ever look past him again. And it worked. The championships were real, the legend was real, the Hall of Fame enshrinement was real. He went from cleaning airport floors at 20 years old to standing next to Michael Jordan as a 5-time champion. But the character he built couldn't fix the crater his father left, couldn't make him a consistent presence for his own children, couldn't quiet the thing underneath the tattoos and the boa, the shy kid from Oak Cliff who just wanted to know he was enough. Phil Jackson gave him a second chance. Basketball gave him a second family. And for 3 more years it worked again. But the game always ends. He gave us 5 championships, 7 consecutive rebounding titles, and one of the most singular careers the sport has ever seen. He did it from a place that should have made all of it impossible. And somewhere between the airport and the Hall of Fame, between the garbage bag on the stairs and the confetti on the floor in Chicago, the invisible kid became the one person in the room nobody could look away from. Being seen by millions was never quite the same as feeling seen. But he never stopped trying.